Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you are. So here I'm going to put out another Cherokee overheat video, but more of this is going to be diagnosing and what components fail in what way for the Cherokee, rather than being like, oh, the stock Cherokee system's fine. That is a yes and no question, or yes and no answer for that question. I'm going to get into it and state by this. The radiator that Chrysler put in this Cherokee from 89 to 2001 here, realistically, it is barely adequate enough in order to cool this thing. It's barely adequate enough. Every single component in the cooling system of the Cherokee needs to be running brand new, like top notch, everything's functioning as it should for this thing to remain cool. This is where the cooling capacity of this radiator for the engine output of heat is barely adequate enough to keep this engine cool. There is a few circumstances in which this radiator is strictly not even able to keep up. And that is like in Florida, you're at 90 degrees with high humidity and you have the AC on. And same thing with like Arizona in the desert, 110 with no humidity, but you have the AC on. The radiator in this thing, again, realistically, is too small for the heat output of the engine and the AC on. It's just not big enough. But you can't exactly put a radiator bigger in this thing without re-engineering the whole front end. It's just, the steering box is in the way. I tried to figure out if I could put a bigger, longer radiator in. The steering box is in the way, so the amount of room you have to work with, it's just doesn't work. So, and there's Mishimoto radiator. Those help, but not as much as you would think. And for the price tag, I don't think it's worth it, because the amount of it costs compared to just a factory like replacement radiator. A lot of the replacement radiators are aluminum radiators. It's just plastic tank ends. The Mishimoto is basically the same thing, but aluminum tank ends. Now the core, I think, on those are a little bit thicker to where it does help to an extent, but not to the point where the price tag is, what is it, $500 for the whole thing? I don't see it being beneficial at all. To be honest, I think it's a waste of money. This Cherokee mostly stays cool, and I just repaired the clutch fan because it was running warm. But we're going to go over every component in the Cherokee and how it fails and why you might be overheating. First and foremost, the thermostat. There's only two ways this thermostat fails: stuck open or stuck closed. Stuck open, it takes like maybe a half hour for this thing to heat up. Stuck closed, you will have this thing 230 degrees in near 3 minutes. It is going to overheat pretty much immediately. And you'll see it bubble in and out through here. And the best way you can tell without removing the thermostat is this upper heater hose will be scorching hot, whereas you grab the upper hose and it's not scorching hot at all. That is a good way. If you burn yourself on this hose, but not on this hose, thermostat's stuck closed. That's two ways the thermostat fails. Generally, I have never had a problem with these thermostats. That's it. I've actually haven't had any issues with the thermostat. Now, second one, water pump. Now, the way the water pump fails is a couple different ways. There's a weep hole in it to where you lose coolant. And I have to say, if you're losing coolant for overheat, you have to find your leak. These water pumps have a weep hole. They can leak coolant out of it. But the other way they fail, depending on your impeller design. So this is a flow cooler water pump. So it has an aluminum different design impeller wheel meant for a high volume pump. This pump is actually a few years old and it actually works pretty good. But a lot of times, if you're having overheat problems and it has to do with the water pump, check the condition of your coolant. And a lot of times the stamped steel impellers on these water pumps will rot away, and your coolant will pretty much, if this thing would open, that would be fantastic. Wow. There we go. See, mine's green. There's a few floaties in there. But anyway, if your coolant is like brown, either the coolant is gone bad, or the other problem is that the impeller wheel, if it's a stamped steel one in that water pump, has rotted away. Now the symptoms with an impeller wheel that's been rotted away, if there's somewhat of impeller wheel left, what will happen is city driving, generally this thing will remain cool. But if you are driving on the highway at a steady speed, the water pump can't keep up and you'll overheat. So the way the water pump fails is either the impeller wheel is rotted away or it's sheared off, but usually when it shears off, this goes whoop, bye, and all your coolant gets dumped on the ground. Impeller wheel rotting away is also intangible with brown coolant, rusty coolant, mud-like coolant. That impeller wheel probably is rotted completely away. And generally, stop and go traffic, you'll be fine in temperature, but highway driving, it won't remain cool. Now, the coolant on the other hand, if you just have bad coolant, if it's brown, mud-like, flush it out the best you can. If you still have overheat problems, you might want to just replace the radiator, because inside the cores or the holes in the radiator are all plugged up. Most of these Cherokees should not have the original coolant in it anymore. But if you do have a brown, mud-like coolant, flush it out. Start with that first, and then see how the water pump performs. If you're city driving, you're okay, but at highway speeds, you're not. The water pump, junk, vamusa. The next one, this electric cooling fan. This electric cooling fan helps with cooling when the mechanical fan is having a hard time keeping up. Mainly this is here for the AC. So the AC puts a lot of heat in front of here. This will come on when you have working AC. It will also come on if you unplug the coolant temp sensor here while the engine's running. The PCM will default, this will command on. If this does not command on when you unplug the coolant temp sensor on a basically 97 to 01 Cherokee, this is how this is wired. If the PCM does not see the coolant temp sensor, the PCM fail-safes to turn this cooling fan on. If this does not turn on, you either have wiring problem or the fan is bad. Now, just for showing you, in my Cherokee, what I did in mine is down here, if you can see, this is my high idle. So it revs the engine up to 1,000 in park and neutral. That's the high idle. This is also fan override. Hear the fan running? So I have this wired in to my Cherokee to where if this is off, the PCM is controlling the fan, the electric fan, which means the PCM will turn the fan on when the coolant temperature is up high enough or the AC is commanded on. This Cherokee doesn't have working AC because the evaporator core is leaking a massive amount of Freon. I'm not fixing that. So the PCM has control of the fan, the electric fan, when I am in off here. On is basically manual override. I override the PCM to turn the electric fan on. That's how mine is wired up. So this one this electric fan, either on off function, the PCM controls it, or I override the PCM and turn that on. When that clutch fan was malfunctioning, I had this electric fan on all the time, and this electric fan barely kept this thing cool. I would have to stop, rev it up to high idle, and let it sit there for it to cool back down, because this thing at idle over 215, 220, the oil pressure has gone to 0. Revved it up on the high idle, came up to about 15 pounds, and just left it there with the cooling fan, electric fan running. So this thing was running hot because of that malfunctioning mechanical fan. So that's the cooling fan. That's how I check it. Either you have the PCM, it has to be running. The PCM, you unplug the temperature sensor right here. You should default this fan on. It's a good way to check it. Or you have like a manual switch like I do where I override the PCM. But the PCM does have control of this fan when the PCM decides this needs to turn on. Excuse the motorcycle noises. Alright, moving on to the clutch fan. So, the clutch fan in this was bad. I just replaced it with a ZJ clutch fan. This is it takes a lot of effort to move this. So, I'm going to jump over to the past and show you the bad clutch fan and everything about it. Okay, so here's what a failed viscous clutch fan is. I can grab it. You see how fast I can move this? This fan does not lock up anymore, or barely locks up. I should not be able to move this fan this fast with my hands. As well as when you start it up, you don't hear this fan screaming. You should hear this fan scream when you first start it up, and then 5 minutes later it'll unlock due to the heat into the clutch. So this clutch fan has failed. And if you try and pinwheel it, it shouldn't pinwheel or move at all when I let go. It's still very slowly moving. So this is a failed clutch fan. Alright, here's another view of a failed viscous clutch fan. If you look right at the center there, the thermostat in which it will move the valving inside for the clutch fan to engage, can you see that it looks wet? The oil that's supposed to be in this viscous coupler is leaking out. So if you do this fast enough, gets easier and easier and easier to the point where it is now going to fully unlock to where you can pretty much pinwheel it. Yeah, I shouldn't be able to do this. This clutch fan is completely garbage. This is the reason why my Cherokee is running warm. Like, it's running 210 and better if I'm really hogging on the thing. I shouldn't be able to do this. This clutch fan has failed. Now, that is a standard duty clutch fan for a Cherokee. This, I'm going to try and use, is for a ZJ. It's a little bit bigger. It is a severe duty clutch fan. The way they go up on duties is that's standard duty, there's heavy duty, and then there's severe duty. This is severe duty. That's standard duty. You can only get a standard duty in a Cherokee, which for a Cherokee with a radiator that's realistically too small for what they wanted this thing to do, that is a no bueno. So this is kind of close to the radiator, the front here. This because the fins are very deep. I'm going to see if I can get this on and use a severe duty clutch fan and see how well that performs. So as you can see, this is how fast I can move this. And it takes quite a bit of effort, where this one, you really have no effort at all. So that's a failed clutch fan. This is a clutch fan I am putting on to try and get this thing to run even cooler under severe operation in the sand dunes. So, failed clutch fan, ZJ severe duty clutch fan that I'm going to install. So as you can see, I have a ZJ severe duty clutch fan installed onto this Cherokee. I actually had to remove this pop piece to push the radiator forward to get the clutch in there. The clutch is actually very close to the radiator but does not touch at all. I have about 1 finger width in between, so it's not bad, but it is tight in there. So this clutch fan locks up immediately. So you have to understand the way this clutch fan fails is either it's locked up all the time, which they rarely do that, or they don't lock up at all or barely lock up. This one I don't think was locking up at all or barely locking up or very little locking up. So how a clutch fan is supposed to work. When you start the engine, you should hear this clutch fan scream until it warms up, which means it is locked in until it warms up, and then it releases. And then it relocks when the thermostat on the front of the clutch fan, like this right here, that will spin and lock up the clutch when it needs to cool off. A clutch fan does rob almost, I think it's like 10 horsepower on these things when it's fully locked up. These don't really lock up 100%. This severe duty will get close. I believe it's like 80 to 90% lockup. But I'd rather keep this thing cool and take 10 horsepower away than have this thing overheat. So let me show you on how a good clutch fan sounds when you start it. So you can't even hear really the engine. So if you could probably, I don't know if you could see it, this fan is pulling so much air that this is actually bending over. That is what you want. Now, if I let this thing run long enough, that clutch fan will eventually unlock and it won't be pulling nearly enough air to really cool the thing. But that's what you want. The biggest mistake that most people make on these Cherokees is they delete that damn clutch fan. This clutch fan will pull more CFM than any electric fan setup. 90% of the electric fan setup you put on this thing cannot pull the amount of CFM a clutch fan can do, even with the standard Cherokee clutch. It just doesn't work. The amount of CFM a mechanical fan will pull will always, 9 times out of 10, outperform any electric fan unless the electric fan is pulling a stupid amount of amps. This electric fan does not pull that much CFM. Hardly any at all. So the biggest problem with most Cherokees overheating is deleting that clutch fan. You should never delete that clutch fan. This clutch fan does a lot in terms of keeping this Cherokee cool without any issues. So Generally at like 210, 215, this mechanical fan should be locking up almost 100% if it's 220 to keep this thing cool. Even with the standard clutch fan, when that was working properly, this thing would actually maintain temperature even bogging on it in the sand dunes. But a lot of people don't understand how much these clutch fans fail. That clutch fan is actually like 3 years old. And I noticed the last time I was on the dunes, this thing was running warmer than it normally does. So I was checking that. Clutch fan, no worky. Now this is a ZJ clutch fan, severe duty, and this thing pulls a hell of a lot more air revved up. You're not going to really hear it at idle. It's not really going to do much at idle, but it's going to do a whole lot when you're under load and you're putting very much stress on this. So you can hear that fan scream when you start it up, even with the standard clutch fan when it's working properly. The last thing I'm going to go over is just airflow. You shouldn't have hardly any obstructions for the radiator. I have the winch here, which creates somewhat of an obstruction, but it's not terrible, especially with the clutch fan. Generally, you want to keep most of this cleared out and no debris or mud or anything in the fins in there. The last radiator I had in here was leaking, as also the fins were nothing but plugged up with mud and I couldn't clean it out, so I just replaced the radiator. But you want as much airflow as possible, and do not get rid of this clutch fan. This is what keeps the Cherokee cool majority of the times. This barely does anything. This does majority because of the amount of CFM the clutch fan can pull, even when a standard duty XJ clutch fan is on this. So, in summary, majority of the times when you have a Cherokee overheating, it's either lack of airflow or that clutch fan screwing up, not locking up. The other way this thing would be overheating consistently would be a head gasket failure. But a lot of times head gasket failures come into the point of the exhaust pipe is nothing but shooting out white smoke consistently, even heated up. And you'll see this boiling over even when the temp gauge doesn't say it's boiling over, because the combustion is actually pushed into here and creating pressure in the cooling system when it doesn't need pressure. So the last thing is a head gasket, but generally it's white smoke out the tailpipe. The gauge doesn't say it's really overheating, but you're having it puke out of the cap, and there's a bunch of pressure in the cooling system without it even being over 210. Because 212 is where pressure should start building, so it raises the boiling point. But if the gauge is reading 210 or below, you really shouldn't have any pressure in the system, even when it's running correctly. Like, even with this fully operating up to temp, if it's about 205 and below, there really shouldn't be any pressure in this cooling system to where you might have a little bit, but you should be able to take off this cap and really have a whole lot of pressure behind it. If you take it off hot, running, be careful. There's usually some pressure behind here that you might burn yourself, but there really shouldn't be hardly any pressure behind this. But if you're having pressure to where it's pushing coolant into that reservoir and making it dump out of that reservoir, and the temperature gauge doesn't say it's overheating, either the temperature gauge is lying or the head gasket went bad and is pushing a whole bunch of combustion into the cooling system. So that's basically the main reasons why the Cherokees overheat. Now, this is a long, drawn-out explanation. A lot of the cooling system components, stock factory, do work. The biggest problem is people either delete this clutch fan or don't understand how these clutch fans work to the point where they think they're working, but they actually are not. This one was failed. I replaced it. It's got a ZJ severe duty in it. This thing should not overheat now. And I'm planning on leaving it that way and running it that way. So hopefully you understand the Cherokee system a little bit better. Realistically, the radiator is too small for this application, but it's what the engineer designed. It's barely adequate enough, especially in hot climates like Florida and like the desert in Arizona. This Cherokee does not have working AC, so the extra heat that puts into the front here is not applicable for my application because the AC don't work. But the AC, with working AC in these things always run hot. And having a severe duty ZJ clutch fan should help out a lot in terms of performing in hot climates and also keeping this thing cool under maybe towing loads or severe, like you're hogging on this thing and you're giving the beans. So that's the explanation. Hopefully that helped you out. The symptoms, basically how it behaves, what does what, and cheat codes on trying to figure out why this thing is overheating. Mine was because the clutch fan has failed. And that's all I'm going to be done for today for the Cherokee. I'll put a picture on the part number. I used a Napa clutch fan, but I'll put a picture of the part number that I used. And that's pretty much it. Hopefully you got some insight on how to diagnose the Cherokee cooling system issues, and I gave a decent enough explanation on how everything works and how they fail. So that's all I have to say. Don't delete the clutch fan. That is your saving grace. Hopefully I'll see you in the next one.